The art of communication. There isn't a day I pass without conflict, external or internal. Personally, I feel uncomfortable around conflict, as do most people. Conflict is something that the human mind doesn't like and tries to avoid most of the time. Most of us go through conflict every day, and we have conflict in almost everything we do. However, conflict is useful, only if we know how to deal with conflict most effectively. Have you ever found yourself in a situation arguing about something that felt so frustrating to argue about? So at a core, annoying and aggravating to the point you think to yourself, that's the silliest opinion I've ever heard. And to what you think to yourself that this thing we are arguing about is non-negotiable. Well, I'll break it to you. Congratulations, you are a human being. We all experience conflict in our lives, especially in today's world, where there are thousands of things to argue about. Boso mentions that we no longer view arguments as something to be worked on, rather something we jump into out of defensiveness and instinct. Now, we humans have fallen into a so-called trap where anything that the other side says, I shall not believe, I shall not give any credibility to, and I shall not give any chance for them to convince me. And I'm going to do everything in my power to prove I'm right, you're wrong, and to stifle you down and your idea, and to raise me up, giving myself a sense of appreciation. Now, the problem is not with the what we are arguing about, it's the how we argue about it. How should we argue? How could we be more effective while communicating in our day-to-day life, in school, or in work, or even on that business trip? Now, we might ask, what's the point of changing the way we argue? When we change the way we argue, it changes the way we feel about ourselves, the way we impose our ideas to people, and the way we decide to live with the others around us. When we change the way we argue, it changes how we are as beings and how we treat the others around us. And it opens the doors to many areas. Dan Shapiro, a Harvard negotiator, identified that there are 3 big barriers that are actually easy to overcome to have more effective conversations: identity, appreciation, and affiliation. Let's go with the first one, identity. Why do we get emotional in these conflicts? It often originates from something deeper, identity. There are core values and beliefs that feel threatened inside of us when we are having that conversation with the other side. The moment our identity gets hooked into the conflict, suddenly the conversation becomes personal. This is what leads our emotions into getting much more involved and much more powerful. Naturally, that would lead to a more sensitive conversation. Boso mentions that the bad arguments we get into, they decrease our confidence, making the conversation, the quality of the conversation even worse. And we could even get to a level where we start thinking to ourselves, boy, this is a wholly different conflict now. It isn't about the issue, it's about my self-pride. Suddenly, your self-worth and dignity is on the line. So what can we do in a situation like this to maintain our identity? We have to know who we are and what we stand for, recognizing ourselves, figuring out what are the core values and beliefs that are pushing me to fight for a stance on this matter. The more we understand who we are, the more we can get our purpose to be met with the other side and stay composed and calm, even when the other side threatens our core values and beliefs. The second barrier Dan Shapiro mentions is appreciation. Both sides in any conversation would love to feel appreciated. And yet, so the last thing they want to do is appreciate the other side. This is a problem. So what can we do? The Harvard negotiator explained this as a solution. Here is where a key element comes in, called communication. If I were to ask you, what is the first step in communicating? At first thought, it would be talking. Well, actually, that's the wrong thing to start off to a good, positive communication. Rather, we should start to listen at first. And not only listen, but give attention. And try to understand what the other side is saying. Boso, a 2-time debate world champion, mentions that in order to be heard, we have to listen. Take the first 10 minutes or so, consciously listening to the other side. Trying to understand what they are saying, trying to understand what they mean. We should try to understand what's the value behind their perspective. Why do they hold this point of view? Why do they hold this perspective about climate change? Why do they hold this perspective about immigration? The moment we understand what they mean, we can see the value in their perspective. Let them know, I hear where you're coming from. And you know what? That actually makes sense. The third barrier Dan Shapiro mentions is affiliation. Affiliation, what's the emotional connection between us and the other side? Affiliation is the bonding or attachment we feel in that moment. Now, we usually go into arguments as me versus you. My opinion on immigration versus yours. My opinion on climate change versus yours. And that's just going to leave the two of us like rams, butting heads at each other and resolving in nothing. So what can we do in a situation like this? The Harvard negotiator explained this as a solution. Turning that person from a rival to a partner, a friend. Our minds are naturally wired to connect the person with the problem. We have to filter the person from the problem itself. Even though they have nothing to do with the problem, our minds naturally do that. So we have to do our best to exclude the person from the problem itself. What's the emotional connection between us and the other side? We usually go into arguments as me versus you. My opinion on immigration versus yours. My opinion on climate change versus yours. And that's just going to leave the two of us like rams, butting heads at each other and resolving nothing. So what can we do? The Harvard negotiator explained this as a solution. Turning that person from a rival to a partner, a friend. Our minds are naturally wired to connect the person with the problem. And that just builds a sense of enmity and hatred towards the person, even though they have nothing to do with the problem itself. Take a second and ask the other side, hey, look, what's your advice on how we can get our purposes to be met at the same time? How can we get our interests met at the same time? The best option is to change the nature of the conversation into a nicer, more pleasant and positive one. A couple months ago, I argued with a friend about climate change, and we started talking about smoking and how it affects his health. Not only his health, but the environment around him. And he wouldn't really open up to what I was saying, and I felt like he wasn't really listening to what I was saying. I started to take what he did more personally, and I did the same to him. I first went into the argument by talking. And I started talking about the negatives and how it was bad for him and why he should stop it. And that just made him feel like he wasn't being respected, and it made him feel bad and like he was being attacked. And then I had to make him feel appreciated and appreciate his point of view first. I let him talk. He took his time, he talked. I got a chance to understand and see the perspective behind him. And then I first went into the argument thinking me versus him, my opinion versus his, my logic versus his. And that resulted in more conflict and harder for us to understand each other. And then I took a second and realized that it was actually my friend who I was trying to help. And then I took a second and started realizing it was my friend who I was actually trying to help. I took a second and asked him, how do you think we can understand and come to a solution in the end? I came with my friend and we came to a solution as one and not as separate minds. And in the end, we came to a solution and we understood each other. He got a chance to understand why smoking was bad for him and why he shouldn't smoke in the first place. And I got a chance why he smoked in the first place and why it was bad for him and why he smokes. So, if we put these three into practice, and everyone we knew also did, it would be a world revolution of greater understanding, greater appreciation, and greater affiliation. How we could transform our communities, how we could transform our relations at work or school, and ultimately how we could transform our world. Boso mentions it could even expand the ability of what we are able to talk about as human beings. Even the most contentious, the most difficult issues, we could end up talking about them in the most humane, productive, and compassionate way. And that right there is success. I believe it's possible, but it starts with each one of us putting in their effort to making a better world for communicating. So if you see yourself today in a situation arguing about something, try to use the three solutions to the three barriers, and you'll see a change in the way you communicate with others. And that's when you realize you've reached success. Thank you.